What if the greatest adversaries in history weren't always new? Across thousands of years, civilizations have told remarkably similar stories. Stories of a serpent in a garden, a tempter in the wilderness, an accuser in the heavenly court, a force that distracts the Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree, a spirit of falsehood, a deceiver, a destroyer. Sometimes the adversary appears as a person, sometimes as an empire, sometimes as an institution, and sometimes as a voice within ourselves. Different cultures, different languages, different explanations. And yet they all seem to preserve a remarkably familiar intuition. There are forces that consistently pull human beings away from what gives life. Some understand those forces spiritually, others psychologically, others historically. Still others simply recognize them as recurring patterns of human behavior. Whether any one explanation fully captures reality isn't the question we're exploring today. Instead, I'd like to ask something much simpler. What does the adversary consistently oppose? Perhaps by walking through a few rooms from history, psychology, and spiritual tradition, we'll discover that civilizations have been noticing remarkably similar movements for thousands of years. You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. History is filled with moments when something life-giving begins to emerge. A people begin moving toward freedom. A new understanding challenges an old assumption. A child walks toward a school that had once been closed to her. Someone dares to ask questions that others have learned not to ask. Again and again, something begins reaching toward greater truth, greater freedom, greater relationship, greater wholeness. And remarkably often, something pushes back. The ancient story of Pharaoh isn't simply about one ruler refusing one request. It's become one of history's enduring images of resistance to liberation itself. Every step toward freedom seemed to be met by another reason to remain in bondage. Centuries later, Galileo's observations challenged humanity's understanding of the heavens. Whether viewed through the history of science or the history of institutions, his story reminds us that new insight is not always welcomed simply because it is true. Sometimes familiar certainty feels safer than honest inquiry. Generations later, a 6-year-old girl named Ruby Bridges walked into a school surrounded by federal marshals. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She wasn't leading an army. She was carrying books. And yet her simple act became a powerful reminder that even movements toward equal human dignity can encounter fierce resistance. Different centuries, different cultures, different circumstances. And yet, each story seems to preserve a remarkably familiar movement. Whenever human beings begin moving toward greater life, history often records resistance moving toward them. Perhaps that's the first pattern worth noticing. Not that opposition always wins, but that meaningful movement almost always meets it. History also preserves moments when resistance becomes something more than a single decision. It becomes organized, not simply through one individual, but through systems, ideologies, institutions, and communities that gradually begin directing their energy toward fear instead of freedom, toward domination instead of dignity, toward control instead of relationship. Perhaps no example illustrates that more clearly than the Holocaust. It wasn't simply the story of one man. It became the story of an entire system organized around dehumanization. Ordinary people became participants in extraordinary cruelty. Language changed. Neighbors became enemies. Fear became policy. Human beings slowly became categories instead of persons. History has preserved many examples like this. Different nations, different ideologies, different centuries. And yet they often seem to move in remarkably familiar directions. People become easier to divide than to understand. Certainty replaces curiosity. Fear replaces relationship. Power becomes more important than truth. The adversary, whatever language we choose to describe it, seems to flourish wherever human beings stop seeing one another as fully human. Perhaps that's the second pattern worth noticing. The greatest dangers in history rarely begin as fully formed catastrophes. More often, they begin with ordinary distortions that slowly become shared. Shared stories, shared fears, shared justifications, until entire systems begin protecting what no longer gives life. Perhaps that's why history asks us not only to recognize great evil, but to notice the smaller movements long before they become impossible to ignore. As I continued noticing these patterns throughout history, I found myself wondering something far more uncomfortable. What if the greatest adversaries aren't always found in history books? What if they sometimes begin much closer to home? Psychology has spent decades studying the ways human beings protect themselves. Fear narrows our attention. Confirmation bias quietly encourages us to notice information that supports what we already believe while overlooking what challenges us. Projection allows us to see in others what we struggle to recognize within ourselves. Certainty can become so comforting that curiosity quietly disappears without us ever noticing. None of these tendencies make us bad people. In fact, many begin as ordinary attempts to protect ourselves. Fear helps us survive. Groups give us belonging. Convictions give us stability. Healthy discernment helps us recognize genuine danger. And yet, when those same instincts become disconnected from humility, relationship, and continual self-examination, they can slowly begin serving something very different. Fear becomes paranoia. Discernment becomes suspicion. Conviction becomes certainty. Belonging becomes tribalism. Protection becomes possession. Perhaps that's why so many spiritual traditions describe the adversary not only as something outside of us, but as something capable of speaking through the stories we tell ourselves. The voice that whispers, "They're not like us. You're already right. You don't need to listen. Protect yourself first." Different traditions tell those stories differently. Psychology describes them differently. History records their consequences differently. And yet, they all seem to be pointing toward another remarkably familiar movement. The adversary rarely begins asking us to abandon everything we value. More often, it quietly invites us to stop growing. Perhaps that's the third pattern worth noticing. As I stepped back from history, I found myself wondering something even deeper. Why do civilizations separated by thousands of years keep telling stories about something remarkably similar? Religious traditions often answer that question spiritually. Judaism speaks of the adversary. Christianity describes temptation, deception, accusation, and division. Buddhism tells the story of Māra, the force that attempts to distract Buddha from awakening. Zoroastrian tradition speaks of enduring struggle between truth and destructive influence. Many indigenous traditions preserve stories about maintaining right relationship with one another, the land, and the sacred, while warning that imbalance carries consequences. Different language, different symbols, different explanations. And yet they all seem to preserve another remarkably familiar observation. Something continually resists movement toward greater life. Psychology notices something similar from another direction. Fear narrows perception. Projection distorts relationships. Confirmation bias quietly reinforces the story we already believe. Systems theory observes that healthy institutions naturally drift unless they are continually renewed. Communities slowly begin protecting the structure they built instead of the purpose those structures were created to serve. Different disciplines, different methods, different vocabularies, and yet history tells the story, religion preserves the story, psychology describes the story, systems demonstrate the story. Perhaps each is noticing the same recurring movement from a different place. Not necessarily explaining it in the same way, but recognizing that human beings continually face the temptation to move away from truth, relationship, compassion, freedom, and greater life. Perhaps that's the fourth pattern worth noticing. Whatever language we choose, the question remains remarkably similar. What helps us return? Perhaps that's why these stories have stayed with me. Not because they convince me that every tradition explains the adversary in the same way. And certainly not because every civilization agrees about where resistance ultimately comes from. History is far too honest for that. Instead, they've invited me to ask a different question. Not, who is the adversary? But, what is the adversary quietly encouraging me to become? And is that true to who I am? Because history suggests that the greatest dangers rarely begin with extraordinary acts. More often, they begin with ordinary choices. The decision to stop listening. The decision to stop questioning. The decision to stop seeing another person's humanity. The decision to protect certainty instead of pursuing truth. Perhaps that's why every generation eventually inherits the same responsibility. To notice, to discern, to return, not once, but again and again throughout a lifetime. Perhaps the question was never simply whether an adversary exists. Perhaps the deeper question has always been this: what helps us keep moving toward greater life? Toward greater truth, greater relationship, greater compassion, greater freedom, greater wholeness. Perhaps that answer looks different in different traditions. Perhaps it's described through prayer, meditation, repentance, forgiveness, community, self-examination, humility, love. Different languages, different practices, different paths of return. And yet they all seem to point toward another remarkably familiar movement. Human beings are capable of drifting. Human beings are also capable of returning. Which makes me wonder, what stories am I believing? What fears have quietly become certainty? Where have I stopped growing? Where have I stopped listening? And perhaps most importantly, what would it look like to take one small step back toward what gives life? No one else can answer those questions for us. Every generation must answer them again. Perhaps that's why civilizations keep telling these stories. Not simply to warn us about darkness, but to remind us that returning has always remained possible. And perhaps that possibility has been quietly waiting for us all along. Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. Come back next week when we talk about how small clusters can create big change. I'll see you there.